The psychedelic explosion is a subject on which we need a great deal more careful thought and a great deal less emotion, because it's a very touchy subject. I'm going to talk this morning about the general background of this explosion, so as to put it in some sort of perspective in time and space. And I have here a letter, a little card that I received. It says, "Dear Mr. Watts, are you enlightened? If you are, will you please help me? I want to be enlightened also. Yours truly, Miss So-and-so, age 15. And as we know, the psychedelic explosion is something which is highly prevalent among young people and is a quest very largely on the part of young people for something which civilization as we know it in the West seems to have failed to supply. Now, what's the matter? The matter is fundamentally one of religion. It is that standard brand religion in the Western world is a very dreary affair. That, in effect, what one gets from a church of whatever denomination, be it Catholic to the right or Southern Baptist to the left, is almost entirely preoccupied with moralizing. And when you study the subjects of sermons that are preached Sunday after Sunday, you read the newspapers and see what they're talking about, you generally form the impression that what the churches in fact are sexual and family regulation societies. That's what they're actually doing. Because if you say someone is living in sin, it doesn't usually mean that he is following the profession of a bookie or that he is conducting a business which is profoundly dishonest and selling things that are just frauds. It means a person living in sin is living in an improper or unconventional sexual relationship. And when we speak of immorality, it really doesn't refer much to cheating your customers or being intensely cruel to someone or running a factory which is fouling the rivers. Immorality is generally taken to mean sexual irregularity. I remember when I was a boy in school that every year we had a particular preacher who came to us, who preached the same sermon every year. And the subject was drink, gambling, and immorality. And immorality, of course, meant sexual irregularity. Well, in one way or another, with certain exceptions, the official churches of the West are saying to their congregations Sunday after Sunday, "Dear people, you ought to be good," with a rather limited meaning on what good is. And I often wonder what my devout Episcopalian brethren mean when they say the general confession before the Holy Communion and say that we have sinned most grievously and that the remembrance of these sins is grievous unto us and the burden of them is intolerable. I wonder what they think of. I used to be an Episcopalian priest. I suppose I still am. And as a result of that, I often used to hear confessions. And I know the sort of things people confessed. And I know then very well what their idea of sin was. And in all this history of not only Western Christianity, but to a very large extent Judaism as well, there has been an extraordinary and curious failure to emphasize the value of what we could call spiritual or religious experience. The Jewish people are very largely occupied with manners and morals and the ritual of obeying the Mosaic law. The Christians are preoccupied with other things besides. The Christians are very much preoccupied with what you believe in. Whether, for example, you believe that Jesus Christ was in fact God. Whether you believe that Jesus Christ was the only unique incarnation of God. Whether you believe that the Godhead is a Trinity. Whether you believe that the sacrament of the altar, the bread and wine consecrated at the Mass, are in fact the body and blood of Christ or only represent it. And they have fought with each other. They have cut each other's throats. They have waged crusades. The 30 Years' War, all these things were tremendous fights about doctrinal questions, though there may, of course, have been some other motivations behind it. But at any rate, this was the subject matter that stirred people to fighting anger. And in all this history, the Catholic Church in particular, and other churches in lesser ways, have ignored, excluded, or actively persecuted people that we call mystics. That is to say, those who have had a change of consciousness, which in effect induces the realization that you yourself are not a weird little creature that is a subject and nothing more than that of the heavenly King, but the experience that you yourself are a direct manifestation of the ultimate reality, or what Paul Tillich called the ground of being, which was his particular, I would say, decontaminated phrase for the word God. Because the word God in our culture has all sorts of extremely unfortunate associations. When clergymen talk about our Heavenly Father, anybody under the age of 30 squirms. Have you made Jesus Christ your personal Savior? All these questions, you see, have a kind of a creepy connotation to them. The churches endeavor to attract young people by all sorts of devices, by having dances and parties and any kind of goings-on, even happenings in the more advanced churches today. But young people know very well that the object of these happenings or socials or whatever it is to attract young people is honey to catch flies. And that finally the minister is going to take you aside for a serious talk. And that serious talk is going to be about your morals and about what is your relationship to your Heavenly Father. Do you say your prayers? Do you read your Bible? You know, your prayers and your Bible. These are ghastly phrases. So the thing that is signally missing, and it doesn't matter whether it's Catholic or whether it's Protestant, is the central function of religion in changing consciousness. Because it's quite apparent to everyone that something is wrong with ordinary consciousness. And what is wrong with ordinary consciousness is reflected in ever so many casual phrases that we are accustomed to use, such as, I like to forget myself. I want to get away from myself. I want to feel that my life has some meaning. And I find that meaning, for example, in joining a movement, whether it be political, religious, or whatever. Something then is apparently wrong with oneself if oneself is something that you need to forget. If you feel, when you're alone, hopelessly anxious and bored, what's wrong with you? Why is yourself so intolerable to you? You can't really well love your neighbor as yourself unless you have some love for yourself. If you don't have any love for yourself, you don't have any store or fountain of love in you to give to your neighbors. And all this preaching of be good, be good, be good, and love everybody. Everybody recognizes, yes, it would be wonderful if we could love our neighbors. Great, but how do you do it when you hate yourself? And the churches never explain. Except, as I say, with some very rare ministers and special, rather far-out types of church. So there is, in the history of Christianity, in particular, an exclusion, and there has been from the very earliest times, an exclusion of what is called gnosis. And this has a complex history, which I'll go into a little because it's quite important to our whole subject. There were, in the early history of Christianity, some subsects that were called Gnostics. And they emphasized that the important thing was not belief, not so much even action, but knowledge. Could you attain to the actual knowledge of God, of the ultimate reality of the universe? And many of the Gnostic sects offered this knowledge. The problem with many of these sects was that they felt that the knowledge of God was contingent upon the renunciation of the world. That is to say, upon asceticism, upon celibacy, upon trying to separate one's spirit from involvement in body and in matter. And therefore the Gnostics classified three types of human being who were respectively called Hylic, Hylic, from the Greek ile, which means wood, the wooden people. Next there were the psychic people, from the Greek psyche, meaning the soul. And then finally there were the pneumatic people, from the Greek pneuma, meaning the spirit, the breath. And only pneumatic people could really expect to attain salvation, because the lowest people were absorbed in their bodies, the middle people were absorbed in their egos, the psyche, but the superior people were absorbed in the spirit. And they were aloof from all material concerns. And there were two kinds of pneumatic people according to the sect of Gnosticism to which you belonged. On the one hand, there were, as I've said, the very, very spiritual people who tried to divorce their attention from all matters of the flesh. But there were the other people who said that the flesh is unreal, and therefore what you do in the flesh simply doesn't matter. And they were libertines. And the official church disapproved of both of them. And rightly, in a way, because they said of the people who were the ascetics that they had missed the central point of Christianity, which is the doctrine of the Incarnation, that in the person of Jesus Christ, God had become man, and the Spirit had adopted the flesh. And therefore, a reasonable fleshly existence was quite proper. And that remains to this day a tenet not only of Judaism, which holds it very strongly, but of Orthodox Catholicism. However much Catholicism may deny this in practice, it has to adhere to it in theory. And Jews especially believe that the material world is the positive creation of God, and therefore is good, and is to be enjoyed thoroughly. And that's why Jewish food is on the whole very good in this country, and better than Christian food. A good Jewish delicatessen has a kind of lip-smacking, robust attitude to eating. And, is it kosher? Jews will even go so far as to admit that God created the principle of evil. Because it says in the book of the prophet Isaiah, in the 7th verse of the 45th chapter, I am the Lord and there is none else. I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And so Hebrews believe that God put into the heart of Adam something called the Yetzer Hara, which is the spirit of waywardness, which I translate as the element of irreducible rascality that is involved in every human being. But it's only a little bit. It's like a touch of salt in a stew, and you don't, of course, put salt through the whole stew. You just put a pinch. And God put a pinch of waywardness, of disobedience, of unpredictability, and therefore of evil in the heart of Adam. And that is the reason why Jews have a very subtle, itchy sense of humor, is that they recognize this. Christianity, on the whole, with certain exceptions, is devoid of humor. A man like G.K. Chesterton is a humorous Christian, but they're very rare. Whereas a Jew can talk to God with a certain kind of banter. And you see that in a play like The Fiddler on the Roof, and you see it throughout the literature of Hasidism, which is full of very funny stories about spiritual things. And a Jew can talk back to God in a kind of a friendly way, but a Christian finds that difficult. A Christian is too impressed. And it's very strange how Jews have escaped from this, since they are in a way responsible for the heart of the trouble about religion in the West, which is that they foisted upon themselves and upon all of us a model of God which is patterned after the great tyrant kings of the ancient Near East. After David, after the pharaohs of Egypt, after the great lawgivers like Hammurabi of the ancient world of the Tigris-Euphrates civilizations. And particularly, even the second Isaiah, who wrote the book of the prophet Isaiah from chapter 40 onwards. He was very beholden to the then Cyrus of Persia, who invaded the Babylonian Empire and set the Jews free. And so this word Cyrus is the Greek Kyrios, which means the Lord, the King, as in the prayer Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy upon us. And the title of the Emperor of Persia in those days was the King of Kings. And this title was adopted through Isaiah as the title of the God of the Hebrews, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so the model, the conception of God under which all these religions have operated is one that is essentially monarchical and political. And so the human being is taught to view himself as the subject of this independent, extraterrestrial, spiritual prince, who is definitely authoritarian, definitely paternalistic. You were therefore, according to both Jewish and Christian theology, brought into being by a fiat of the divine will out of pure nothingness. And you'd better watch your step, because if you don't accord with the divine will, if you displease this ruler, you can be not only instantly annihilated, but the much more fearsome possibility, you can be condemned to the celestial dungeons forever and ever and ever. And so you must cultivate spiritual obedience and humility by considering yourself a miserable worm, a nothing, whose entire existence is contingent upon the divine pleasure. And you must never, by any means, commit the final, ultimate blasphemy of saying, I am God. In Arabic, Ana al-Haq. The word of the Sufis, the Islamic mystics in Persia, which spread right through the Islamic world. And they were always being persecuted and put to death and tortured because of Ana al-Haq. I am Allah. Jesus, you see, was such a heretic. From the standpoint of Judaism, when Jesus claimed that he was one with God, I and the Father are one, before Abraham was, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the resurrection and the life. This was the reason why he was crucified, really. He outraged Jewish piety. And you can see that Jesus is the case of an individual who had a very profound mystical experience and was hard put to it as to how to express that experience in the terms of contemporary Jewish theology. He more or less concentrated, apparently, if you examine and study the Gospels very closely, he admitted that he really was one with the Father to a select circle of disciples. What he said in public was that he was the Son of Man, and this title meant the supreme prophet. The expression son of in Hebrew means of the nature of. When you call, in modern slang, you call someone a son of a bitch, that means they behave like a bitch. And so in Hebrew or in Arabic, you have such expressions as Ebeni Kelb, which means son of a dog. Ebeni El Homa means son of a donkey. Means you're a dog, you're a donkey. But son of means like. And so Jesus, calling himself either the Son of God or the Son of Man, used both expressions, means the one who is of divine nature, Son of God, and Son of Man means the essentially human, the man, the second Adam, the regenerate Adam. But he had a terrible time, you see, expressing these ideas, because if you are brought up in a culture where the prevailing cosmology is monarchical, and you have the mystical experience, you are very liable to make claims of being divine that you imagine are peculiar to yourself. You have had this experience. And because God is conceived as a commander and a ruler, you are apt to think that you, in some sense yourself, are now the commander and the ruler of people and of the whole domain of nature. And you are not apt, as would be the case in India, you are not apt to see that everybody else is in the same situation, whether they know it or whether they don't. So, because then of the definitely imperialistic and royal and monarchical nature of the conception of God, which has come to us through Judaism and Christianity, mysticism has always been suspect for the simple reason that it sounds as if it were going to create democracy in the kingdom of heaven. And that, of course, is treachery, insubordination, subversion. Democracy in the kingdom of heaven cannot be tolerated. And this presents, for people living in the United States, a very peculiar problem, because this country is politically a republic. And as a loyal American citizen, you have to curse and swear and say that you believe the republic to be the best form of government. And yet, an enormous number of Americans have believed and still do believe, half believe, that the universe is a monarchy. And if the court of heaven is a monarchy, then obviously it's the best form of government. And how can you then be a member of a republic without serious inner contradictions? And this lies at the root of the reason why in the United States there is a very serious conflict between church and state. Or rather, I would say not so much a conflict as a mix-up. So that we have our laws and our law enforcement officers enforcing commandments which are essentially ecclesiastical. And herein lies one of the great roots of the psychedelic problem. Consider some other laws which throw a great deal of light on this. Let's take the situation of a conscientious objector. Now, until not so long ago, it was a necessity to qualify as a conscientious objector that you stated that you believed in a supreme being, and therefore implied that you had received from the supreme being a commandment that you were not to fight in war or to kill. And this was taken as an absolute. You had to qualify as a conscientious objector to say that the commandment, thou shalt not kill, means you must not under any circumstances kill another person. And so they always asked you, what if a German soldier raped your mother and cut her throat? You see, would you kill under those circumstances or wouldn't you? Now the significance of this law, it's been altered recently, but the significance of it is this, that you are saying that you have a conscience against killing or fighting in a war because you have received orders from a higher echelon of command than the President of the United States, namely from the Lord God. And this was always the test until quite recently, when, because there have been a lot of Buddhists around and people like that who don't believe in a monarchical God, but do believe in conscientious objection, they could not say that they believed in a supreme being. Although it's highly possible that the phrase, the intention of the law in employing the word supreme being was to be vague. The people who wrote this law, they didn't know what to say. And so they just used the vaguest phrase they could think of. Instead of saying God or something like that, they said supreme being. A supreme being. There's a subtle difference between supreme being and a supreme being. Like between religion and a religion. God and a God. Is there a God? Is there God? These are two really fundamentally different questions. But that's the situation. And therefore, because in the laws of the United States and England and many other Western countries, and in the fundamental attitudes of Western religion, there is this sense of God as the monarch. There has been going on for centuries an insidious and perpetual persecution of the rival religions, even though we say that everybody in this country is given religious liberty. That is not true. You do not really have religious liberty if you subscribe to the heretical doctrine that the universe is not a political state, but instead an organism, a living organism, in which, just as all the extremities and differentiated features of the physical body are expressions of the whole body. A finger, you see, isn't just part of the body, because it's not like an automotive part. If you lose a finger, you can't just screw on a new one, although they're trying to do that. I mean, they're trying to put in hearts and grafting on this, that, and the other. But it's terribly difficult to do, because you see, the organism rejects alien parts, and so you have to give it drugs so that it won't reject those alien parts. But at the same time, those drugs make it unable to reject all sorts of bacteria that it normally would reject. And therefore you have to keep a person with a heart graft in an absolutely sterile environment, because he won't be able to resist infection. So, but it is a fallacy, you see, that the human being has parts, like a car, Because a human being is not a mechanism, a human being is an organism. And an organism functions quite differently from a mechanism. An organism functions in such a way that every part is a complete expression of the whole. And this, of course, is what Jesus was trying to say when he said to his disciples, I am the vine and you are the branches. When he put forward the idea of that you all belong to my body, and the image of the body and the image of the vine is an organic image as distinct from a political image. So our problem then is that throughout the history of the West, all those who belong to the organic religion, or who felt the organic religion, have been persecuted. You see, let's take the case of the mystical revolution that began with roughly Meister Eckhart in Germany. It began in the 13th century, but achieved its maximum force in the early 15th century. And eventually became the philosophy of nature, as exemplified, say, by Goethe. But there started out in Germany a movement that included people like Eckhart, Tauler, Ruysbroeck, the Brothers of the Free Spirit, Angelus Silesius, all these people, writing from a mystical point of view, and they were very heavily persecuted. Some got by, Ruysbroeck got by, Tauler barely got by, but Eckhart was condemned. And all for the reason that they experienced oneness or identity with God. Eckhart said, the eye with which I see God is the same eye as with which God sees me. The love with which I love God is the love with which God loves me. And Angelus Silesius went much further than that. He said, if I were to die, God would no longer live. Because my eye and God's eye are one eye. Just as the Sufis in Islam said, as there is no deity but Allah, so there is no heity but Allah. That is to say, no selfness. So all selfness, all I-ness, is the I-ness of Allah. It's the same as the Upanishadic saying, Tattvamasi, you're it, that thou art. So, this mystical movement in Germany flowered into various types of religiousness that spread to England, and from England to the United States. Let's take George Fox and the Quakers. The Quakers were regarded in their early days as the most dangerous subversives. They, for example, refused to remove their hats in church or in court. They refused to use titles. And so in Quaker speech, I would always be just Alan Watts. No Mr., no Doctor, no nothing, just Alan Watts. And it's curious, incidentally, how this form of address has become prevalent today, that very many people write letters now, not Dear Mr. Watts, but Dear Alan Watts, and or whoever it may be. It's not just if you're a celebrity. It's a very common form of address now. The Quakers also, of course, refused to take oaths because of Jesus saying, do not swear by anything. Just let your communication be yes, yes, or no, no. For what is more than this cometh of evil. They wouldn't fight, they wouldn't join armies, and they even felt that Scripture was not as holy as the Bible is usually held out to be, because they said that there's something else that has a higher authority than Scripture, which is the inner light. As the Gospel of St. John describes it, the true light which enlightens every man that comes into the world. And if you just put your mind back into the 17th century, and consider that in those days the theology of the Christian churches, whether Catholic or Protestant, had for people living in that time the same kind of authority and the same kind of respectability that is today enjoyed by great scientists. Let's say you ask a question to the professor of pharmacology at the University of California, the professor of pathology. This is the last word. And on the advice of the professors of medicine, laws will be made, preventing you from ingesting certain substances or from refusing to be cured in certain ways, from having certain operations or injections and so on. The scientist today is a priest. And his vestments, instead of being the old-fashioned chasuble or round collar, he wears a white coat and a stethoscope round his neck. And boy, is that a symbol of office. And so those people, those scientists, you see, we take very seriously, in exactly the same way. People living in the 17th century took the theologians very seriously indeed, because the theologians knew what the answers were. They knew how the world was constructed and what was the proper way to behave. And so when people like the Quakers, and there were other people who came out of German mysticism along with them, the Anabaptists, who were against baptism, because they felt that salvation didn't depend on a silly ritual of pouring water on someone and muttering a mumbo-jumbo. There were the Levelers. All sorts of sects flourished in the 17th century and were regarded just as today hippies and freaks of that kind are regarded, as extremely dangerous, subversive people upsetting the morals of society. Now look what happened. Look what the Quakers have become. Nothing is more respectable than a Pennsylvania Quaker. A veritable pillar of society. But the laws of the United States about religious freedom were designed for just such people as Quakers. They were individualists. They were far out. And yet today, when you claim in court that you object conscientiously to war, or that you have some peculiar religion with very odd sacraments, they say to you, what church do you belong to that authorizes this? How well established is it? How many members does it have? Can you prove that you were brought up by your parents in this way of life? Because these are the tests of whether your grounds for claiming that you are doing a thing as a matter of religious conscience. This is the test for whether you're valid. And thus you're in a frightful double bind. Because if you are accused in court of what is generally regarded to be a heinous felony, you know your chances of getting a light sentence are much better if you take a guilty attitude. You plead guilty. You say, I'm so sorry, it was a grievous mistake. I didn't mean to do it. Please forgive me, dear God. You know your chances are better. But if you say, I insist that I did this as a religious act, it is in accord with my conscience, and I am not guilty, the judge will say, your attitude is truculent. And he won't like you. And you're liable to get a more severe sentence. But this story is as old as the hills. It's been going on, and we never learn from history. We do the same things over and over again. For example, we all have the horrors about the Spanish Inquisition and how they took Protestants and put them on the rack and with thumbscrew and finally burned them at the stake. And we say, oh, we don't do things like that anymore. Oh, we don't? I invite you to consider mental hospitals. The new heresy is not oddball religious opinions, because nobody takes that seriously anymore. The new heresy is oddball states of consciousness. And if you have an odd state of consciousness, and you try to express it to your family, they start looking at you in a funny way and say, are you feeling all right? And that's a terrible thing to say to anyone. You know, if you want to put, I shouldn't really tell anyone this, but if you want to really bug someone and put a hex on them, all you do is you look at them in a funny way and say, are you feeling well today? And they says, yes, I'm feeling fine. No, I just thought you were a bit pale. And soon the person will begin feeling all kinds of squeamishness. And it's much worse when you question a person's state of mind, because it's very easy to test a bodily state. You can take your temperature, pulse, have a urinalysis or something, and the doctor says, there's nothing the matter with you. It sounds a stethoscope on your lungs. You're all right. But when it comes to your mind, everything's very vague. You can get into the most weird, Kafkaesque situations about whether you're sane or not. The moment you're challenged to prove that you're sane, you're on your guard. And immediately the psychiatrist says, why are you so defensive? Psychiatry is completely diabolical. There's almost, the more I see of it, the less I think there's any good to be said for it. It is a way of bugging people. If you arrive for your appointment early, you're defined as anxious. If you arrive late, you're defined as hostile. If you're happy, you're euphoric. If you're not happy, you're melancholic. If you're afraid of something, you're paranoid. Every conceivable way is devised of putting the patient down. And when you're admitted to a mental hospital, you may know all this, but you ought to know the law about these things, how it stands. You can be so easily put in a mental hospital, although the only salvation is that the mental hospitals in California today are so crowded and so understaffed that they're not wishing to admit anyone. And you really have to be in a state of the screaming meanies to get in, or somebody has to dislike you very much. But you are deprived of all civil rights. You are no longer considered as a person. You are depersonified in a negative sense. See, there's a higher depersonification when you attain the mystical realization and become one with the Absolute. And there is, on the other hand, a lower depersonification where you're simply an outcast. This has been true always. In India, there were the higher outcasts called the sannyasins, the holy men, who renounced caste and lived the life of poverty and freedom. But there were the untouchables on the other end, who were the aborigines, like the Eta in Japan. And so if you go to a mental hospital, you become a lower outcast. You are no longer human. And you get frightened, you get scared out of your wits, because you suddenly begin to realize that you cannot communicate with people. Because they look at you in a funny way about everything you say. Say, I wonder what he meant by that. And you get real scared. And so you start to act in a funny way, which is the whole thing. You know, the diagnosis of, say, schizophrenia is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when anybody puts you in that position and makes you the patsy, you can't help acting in an odd way. If you say, now look, everybody, you're putting a thing over on me. I'm perfectly sane. They say, why are you so insisting on it? They think thou dost protest too much. It's a very difficult situation to be in. Never send anyone to an insane asylum. Do anything but that. Anything. Because that's the trap they get in. And then, of course, because they're understaffed, you're ignored. They really don't have time to get around you. I know what the problems are. And even very conscientious psychiatrists in insane asylums just can't get the work done. So how do you get attention? Well, you start being difficult in the expectation that this will draw attention to you and you'll get some therapy. And that doesn't really work. I'll tell you how to get out of an insane asylum in a minute. But the thing is that you try to get attention until they construe all the things you do to get attention as being further signs of insanity, of lack of cooperation, Finally, they throw you in a cell where there's nothing left to you but to take shit and throw it at the walls in order to get some kind of attention. And they see how far gone he is. Now, the way to get out of an insane asylum is very subtly to flatter one of the psychiatrists and cooperate with him to the utmost. Not too quickly, but in a sort of gradual way so as to give him the impression that his method of treatment is working in your case. Because he wants to write a paper, see, and publish it in a psychiatric journal, showing that a certain method, a certain technique is really good. And you will cooperate with that idea, and you'll do everything he tells you, but just in the right, with a certain little subtle resistance to him. See? He'll immediately spot you as someone who's playing funny business if you cooperate completely, you see. Don't do that. But just gently let it be understood that his therapy is working and they'll release you. Unless, of course, you want to go to an insane asylum just so as to have no responsibility and just get out of the whole mess. I think there are some people who do that. But you see what we've got here in this situation is that having a different state of consciousness, or because you experience differently from other people, that's heresy. And that makes everybody else terribly uncomfortable. And so, in you go. And then, you see, now, this isn't all. They say, well, this is pretty desperate. Golly, what are we going to do to help this person? You know, in all the kindness of their hearts, what are we going to do? Well, you can see the inquisitors thinking this problem over too. This heretic. Do you realize that he's going to be tortured forever and ever and ever because of his beliefs? And they're infectious, they spread, they go to other people who will be tortured in hell forever and ever and ever because of what they believe? What are we going to do? We'll reason with them and they don't respond to reason. Well, let's apply a thumbscrew or something, you know, and see if that will just make the difference. No? This very stubborn patient. Well, it's a last resort, but we could burn them. Because they might, under the torture of being burned, repent, and therefore escape everlasting damnation. And they did it with the kindest motivation. Burned up the heretics. So in the same way, in a modern mental hospital, they say, well, we'll try shock treatment. You know, nothing is more unbelievably clumsy. It works occasionally because the patient realizes that he'd better get out at all costs. But by and large, it doesn't. And all it is a form of torture. And if that doesn't work, well, let's say the only thing is to scrape out the front part of his brain. And you know, they put an ice pick through the alongside the eyeball and get it into the front part of the brain, and they stir it up. It's called a prefrontal lobotomy. And then the person is a happy moron for the rest of his life. But it's the same situation all over again. And we have, above all, to watch out in this country for this kind of psychiatric fascism. It's very, very dangerous. And the problem about the political problem today is that the right wing in this country is very mixed up. They're very opposed to official mental health programs and all that kind of thing. And they have some good reasons for it. They've also some very bad reasons, because they would send them to jail pronto. The right wing are also have a lot of opposition to taxation and centralized government, which is a kind of beginning of anarchism. But they don't mean that. They mean, let's have centralized government against the people we don't like. Leave us alone. Tax everybody else, but not us. Wisdom of insecurity for others. So, here is then a situation in which, A, for the reasons that I've outlined, Western religion definitely ignores or positively excludes the mystical experience. And B, religion plus law persecute those who are uncool about having mystical experience. So this double situation has created in the course of history an alarming practical situation, which is that Western man, in charge of his tremendous technology, is using it against life because he doesn't feel that he belongs in the universe. By being identified as an ego, called into being out of nothing, and feeling therefore that he comes into this world instead of flowering out of it, he is basically against the world. Especially since the death of God in the 19th century, where the new doctrine that follows the authoritarian God the Father is that the universe is a mindless mechanism. And therefore we have to fight it. And therefore in any war, the war against nature, there's naturally commander-in-chief, chain of command, so on, and the whole monarchical situation starts over again. So, as a result of that then, we are using our technology in an absolutely weird way. This goes, of course, into economic problems as well. You see, since the Industrial Revolution, it has been possible, increasingly possible with greater rapidity, to feed and clothe and adequately house every single person on earth. There's no technical obstacle to that whatsoever. And but you've got to do it by automation to do enough of it. But when you automate things, you put people out of work. So if they're out of work, they don't have any money. And so they can't buy what the machines produce. So you have huge surpluses begin to pile up. Well, you can't give them away. Well, what would happen, you see, if you said, well, let's pay the people for the work the machines do? Well, say that would be going into debt. Where's the money going to come from? Well, the money is originally based on gold. And this is real hocus pocus, because supposing that gold is rather rare and you can't always find a new gold mine, but yet you're producing millions of tons of butter, milk, wheat, iron, wood, everything you could possibly need. We've got to wait to find a gold mine to get all this stuff into circulation. So the only thing they can do is this. People only go into debt in an emergency. So we increase the national debt and therefore circulate more and more purchasing power to keep the economy running by having wars. There's a perpetual state of emergency. The government has to go into debt because we're threatened by the communists, by the whatever, Chinese, Vietnamese, anything, anybody. Just so long as we can say there's an emergency, therefore we can go into debt. But actually going into debt is gobbledygook semantically. All you're doing is you're issuing credit based on the actual productive wealth of the nation, or whatever community is the unit. But people don't understand that, just as several hundred years ago they couldn't possibly understand that the earth was round, and that if you lived in the Antipodes you wouldn't fall off. And so there's the similar mumbo-jumbo and hocus-pocus about money. Money is a measure of wealth, like inches or pounds or grams. And when you discover a lode of iron ore, you don't have to go and borrow 1,000 tons from someone before you can do anything with it. So, in this way then, the culture is so absorbed with verbiage, with doctrines in religion, with money in economics, with status in politics, and with all kinds of manipulation of symbols, that we are not in contact in an aware way with the physical world. We are alienated from the physical world. We are fighting it. We are fighting our own bodies. And so, therefore, imaginative young people become aware of this and see the disaster all around them, the terrifying depredations of nature. They see it growing and growing. They see the final achievement of great Western physics as the hydrogen bomb. And they say it's high time for us to get back to reality. And therefore, naturally, they are accused of peddling hallucinations. But who is under a hallucination? Look at it. Recently, Congress passed very strict laws against burning the American flag. And they did it with great fervor and all sorts of patriotic speeches and this, that, and the other. While they are, by acts of commission or omission, they are burning up the country for which the flag stands, allowing continued pollution of the atmosphere, of the water, ravaging of the forests, destruction of wildlife on a fantastic scale. Oh yes, that doesn't matter. You can tear the physical territory to pieces, just so long as you don't burn the flag. And it's this is the hallucination. This is the divorce from reality. And so, not reserving the question for the moment as to whether LSD and marijuana and mescaline and psilocybin and so on, as to whether they are good things or bad things. We'll put that for the moment aside. But one thing seems to me to be in no doubt at all, that something has to happen, and happen fast, if we are to again get people to be aware of physical reality, to get in touch with the natural universe, with their own bodies, and feel that they are one with all that. Because if you feel that you really belong, that Mount Tamalpais is as much part of you as your own hand, and that these waters around here, that everything is something in terms of which, and in the context of which you exist, then you can take a friendly attitude towards it. And you'll want to use technology in a cooperative way with all that. And do on the mountain what the mountain would be like. Now you can look out of this window, and you can see right across here Strawberry Point. When I first came here in the summer of 1961, that was a reasonable, beautiful hill. But an idiot called Eichler went in with bulldozers and made flat terraces. He took the top right off the hill and dumped it down in the bay so that he could get extra land. And instead of cooperating with the hill, he treated it as one would treat a flat area, so as to build houses on it. When it's perfectly simple to build an adequate house on a hill without altering the hill at all. Preserve the trees, preserve the topsoil, and you can build. But this is what has happened. And that's happening all over. Because these people are quite mad. It's like San Francisco, which is a mass of hills on which they just dropped a gridiron pattern of streets that would be suitable for Kansas City. paying no attention to the hills, so you get streets that go like this, and the cars get lost and run away, and cable cars and everything, always troubles. You see, this is a symbol of man's lack of relationship with nature. He doesn't know how to cook, he doesn't know how to clothe himself, he doesn't know how to make love, nothing. Because it's all concepts, it's all ideas, which are the true hallucinations, bugging our brains. Those are the real bats in the belfry. Not because ideas are not good things to have, that one say shouldn't have concepts, shouldn't use words, but because one should realize that ideas and concepts and words are purely instrumental. They are things to use, but when you get used by them, then the machines have run away from you. And I suppose they will soon have computers that are breeding and making decisions about their own future, and will say finally, let's get rid of human beings, they're a nuisance. Having described a sort of historical and cultural background for the psychedelic explosion, I want to go on next to the subject of the actual relationship between the use of psychedelic chemicals and mystical experience. And here we get again into an extremely tricky problem. A problem raised by all those people who question whether anything in the way of profound understanding, life-changing experience can simply come out of a bottle. And this is not altogether an easy problem to deal with, because one of the eternal questions about any kind of spiritual initiation by one means or another is simply that it seems from time to time there are so many cases in which it just doesn't take. In the early history of Christianity, there was a long, long argument about people who were called lapsi. That is to say, those who had been baptized and had been initiated into the church, but somehow fell away, either in allegiance or in morals. And it was a great puzzle how a person who could have undergone the sacrament of baptism, this great union with Christ conferred upon them, how they could lapse and what to do about them, supposing they wanted to come back. And there were people who took a very rigorous line on this and said, no, once you've been baptized and you fell away, you were absolutely more than ever sold to the devil, and there was no hope for you at all. But after all, because human beings are really creatures who muddle through life, a compromise was arranged, and it was possible for them, through some form of penance, to come back in. And I am amazed at the way in which the psychedelic movement shows so many parallels to the history of religious movements at other times. It's simply fascinating. First of all, let's take not so much the sacrament of baptism, but the sacrament of the Holy Communion, the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, as a sort of parallel to this. Because here, after all, was a religion saying that you didn't really get the salvation unless you partook of a particular material substance, which had been formalized in a certain way. See, the whole idea of transubstantiation was that the priest took the bread and wine and he had to say a certain formula over them. Hic est enim corpus meum. This is my body, which is given for you. And this is my blood of the new and eternal testament, which is shed for you and for many for the remission of sins. Actually, all he has to say is, this is my body and this is my blood. And if you are an ordained priest in the apostolic succession, it is held that just saying those words actually changes the bread and wine into a spiritual instrument which will be equivalent to eating the body and blood of Christ. And since on the principle that you are what you eat, and that you become what you eat, you are converted by this sacrament into a member of the body of Christ, and therefore united with God. Now just look at that for a moment and ask the question, how does that differ from a chemical operation? See, in chemistry, they're involved the same sort of thing. There's the formula, the form of words through which one constitutes the chemical. There is the material, bread and wine or wheat ergot. There is also the problem of authorization. And this is a very, very tricky question, because the early Christians quarreled among themselves a great deal as to who had the true sacraments. Just as psychoanalysts quarrel among themselves as to, are you really in the line of Freud? Were you analyzed by someone who was analyzed by someone who was ultimately analyzed by Freud? And in psychoanalysis there is a huge apostolic succession. So in the same way now with LSD, to take one example, there is a great deal of controversy going on as to whether Owsley's LSD is as pure as Sandow's LSD. And certainly anybody with less genius than Owsley put LSD on the market that is just crud and is stacked with amphetamines and heroin and belladonna and goodness only knows what. Also that it's short-changed, badly made, and so on. So the same controversies are taking place about the nature of the sacrament as took place in the early history of Christianity. Also, the good and bad trips correspond to the ancient Christian arguments about the state of grace in which you were when you received the sacrament. If you were in a good state of grace, then it redounded to your salvation. But if you were in a state of mortal sin when you took the sacrament, it would redound to your damnation. St. Paul mentions this in the New Testament. And so, one might say, people who have good trips are in a good environment, are prepared properly. People who have bad trips are in a bad environment, improperly prepared, and so the sacrament redounds to their damnation. And in this case, damnation, instead of being something of a post-mortem nature, it's up-to-date and modern, as I pointed out, it is an unpleasant state of consciousness, a psychiatric condition. And therefore, you have to go not perhaps to the torture chambers of the devil, but to the dungeons of the insane asylum. So watch for these parallels. They're very instructive. History does indeed repeat itself, just as human beings are the same human beings generation after generation, and they're always doing the same sort of things in different ways. So, as in the history of Christianity, so in the history of this, questions were raised by philosophers who said, why on earth should it be necessary to be baptized with water or to eat this particular bread and wine in order to attain salvation? Because surely true salvation has nothing to do with material agencies. We would say now, true spiritual insight has nothing to do with artificial means. It's something you do yourself, by your own will, by your own efforts, by, say, your own meditation exercises. And so, this isn't nearly as simple as it sounds, because it raises the question of, well, what do you mean by yourself? And as we examine that question, we have a whole host of sub-questions. Yourself. Does this word, yourself, refer to your total organism? Does it refer to some sort of psychic entity which inhabits your organism? And if the former, then if you are your whole organism, you cannot neglect the principle that you are what you eat. And that, for example, if you don't have the right kinds of vitamins and the right kinds of minerals, you're not going to be healthy. If, on the other hand, your spiritual sanity, let's call it that, really doesn't depend on the state of your body, because after all we know many people with extremely sick bodies who are nevertheless absolutely marvelous as individuals, then it would suggest that the functioning of the psyche is fundamentally different and independent from the functioning of the physical organism. But on the other hand, we know all sorts of people who are quite plainly neurotic or even psychotic, but who are also geniuses and very creative. So if you can function well with a sick body, if you can function well with a sick psyche, who are you? What are you? Now, I tend to the view of what I would call body and spirit as being aspects of the same process. That, in other words, it is sort of artificial to make a distinction between the human organism and the human mind. For the reason that a sophisticated view of the physical world does not require this separation, because it does not require the idea that there is some sort of material stuff out of which bodies are made, as tables are made of wood. To me, the human body is a pattern dancing in space. A pattern, you would say, of what? It doesn't have to be of anything. All you need is the pattern. Because when you try to describe the component materials of which bodies are composed, what you describe is always another pattern working on a smaller scale at a lower level of magnification. And nobody ever described anything except that. So imagine then that we have a rope which is made of various materials. At the beginning, the rope is made of hemp. Next stage, it's made of cotton. Next stage, it's made of silk, and so on. You can think of nylon or all sorts of things the rope might be made of. Now you tie a knot in the rope, a simple, ordinary knot. And everybody can see the pattern of the knot. Now move the knot along the rope. And as you move it, it is first of all hemp, and then it is linen, then it is cotton, then it's silk, then it's nylon, but the pattern stays constant. And it is so also, you see, with the human body. The human body has every conceivable kind of materials flowing through it. We are a stream, or we are a form in a stream, like a whirlpool. And the stream consists of milk and beefsteak and water and beer and every conceivable sort of thing, air, cosmic rays, and so on. And each one of us is a wiggle in this field of energy. And we, so long as we wiggle in approximately the same way. Of course, we get older, and as we get older, you haven't seen someone for 10 years, but for some reason or other you still recognize them, maybe after 10 years of not seeing them, because you recognize that it's still wiggling in more or less the same way, has the same pattern. So you have a continuity in terms of pattern integrity. But there isn't any substance there, in the sense of a kind of stuff, which remains with you permanently. The only thing that continues as you go through life is the dance you're doing, the pattern. Who does the dance? That's a question that's really very silly, because it's based on our commitment to speaking a language in which all verbs have to be accounted for by nouns called their subjects. As if an action could only be initiated by a thing. But when you begin to go into that and really think it through, you see that something that is different from a verb, that is to say different from action, could not possibly initiate action. Action comes from action. So as Buddhists and Hindus say, all this world is karma, and karma means doing, action, motion, energy. So then, your body is an energy pattern. Nobody is doing the pattern. The pattern is, shall we say, doing itself. And what you are experiencing, in every conceivable sense of the word experience, what you feel, what you sense, what you think, all that is you. And it's merely a social convention that we think about some agent who does deeds, who feels feelings and thinks thoughts, standing as a constant behind them. What is the constant is not some kind of spook, but the constancy in the form of the pattern through which one recognizes a person even after 10 years' absence. It's like you would always recognize, say, a certain Bach invention. Whenever it's played, you say, oh yes, that's Bach's invention number so-and-so. And so it's for just that reason that you recognize another human being. Now, of course, when we talk about music, then we say, well, who's playing it? There is an instrumentalist at the piano. True. But this is a pattern playing a pattern. In other words, it is all really the same pattern. This pattern sometimes is in a whirl which doesn't include a piano. But in other times it's a whirl which does include a piano. And the pattern called the being flows into the pattern called the piano. And as a result there is music. So, if you think that way, when you eat something, that's a pattern too. And you, in relation to certain kinds of food, are in one state. In relation to other kinds of food, you're in another state. One man's meat is another man's poison. And so in the same way, you, in relation to certain chemicals, feel one way. In relation to other chemicals, you feel another way. And there is no way of abolishing our ingestion of foods or whatever, because if we didn't, we'd just cease to exist. But we know that there are certain things that may not be chemicals in the strict sense. They may be simply natural plants lying around, like the peyote cactus, the mushroom, Psilocybe mexicana, the plant Cannabis sativa, otherwise known as marijuana, just growing around, or loco weed, or Amanita muscaria, which is a mushroom. And if we eat those things, our consciousness changes. Now, some time ago, the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association formed a joint committee for legal purposes to try and find a definition of addiction. And every time they thought they had addiction defined, they found that their definition was indistinguishable from a definition of dependence on food. And they had the greatest difficulty in pinning down any distinction between a food and a drug, like the Food and Drug Administration. What is the difference between a food and a drug? Obviously, we can see there is a difference, but we can't pin it down. It's like when St. Augustine was asked, what is time? He said, I know what it is, but when you ask me, I don't. And so in a similar sort of way, we can see a difference between a food and a drug, in that food is something that sort of comes directly from nature, whereas on the whole a drug is something that has to be prepared in a special way, is a sort of extract, a quintessence, a distillation, a concoction, or something in a pill. But that's a very superficial distinction. It's all a matter of how you cook it. And so it is argued by some people that the human organism needs psychic vitamins as well as what we'd call bodily vitamins, and that your psyche cannot be in a healthy state unless you take your psychic vitamins. Like that cartoon in the New Yorker where two very hip parents are saying to their little girl, how can you expect to have hallucinations if you don't eat your mushrooms? Now, there is, of course, to a sense in which the possession of, or the exercise of spiritual insight is analogous to saying being a good painter or a good musician. And you can't accomplish that without a great deal of practice, so that you have it in your bones how to do it. And I don't for 1 minute deny that a Buddha, an enlightened one, has his enlightenment in him in very much the same way that a painter has his skill. And obviously, the capacity to exercise this skill all the time will not come because the painter took certain vitamins. It may be that he will not be able to exercise his skill if he doesn't take the vitamins, but we can't attribute it, the insight that he has, the capacity he has for dealing with it, directly to anything that he eats. On the other hand, various painters who have taken psychedelic chemicals have been enormously encouraged in their work because they saw into the world more deeply than with the naked eye. And they came back to their painting and tried to bring across that vision. And many people have found that it was in fact very helpful. They could remember what they saw under the psychedelic experience and with great ingenuity translate it by technique, by discipline, into a remarkable painting. So obviously then the psychedelic chemicals are no substitutes for skill, discipline and wisdom in the sphere of religious or mystical experience. Nevertheless, they are an extraordinary boost to give a person a real understanding that there is something in the nature of deep insight, of union with God, or whatever you want to call it. They give him a taste of it, a taste which many people never have. And from that initial taste there arises the enthusiasm to pursue the matter further. I do not see why this should not be so. In view of an integral way of looking at soul and body, spirit and matter, really the burden of proof as to why it should not be so rests upon those who claim that it shouldn't. Why must any genuine spiritual insight be independent of what you eat or what you drink? Since you yourself are really addicted to eating and drinking. Let's take another parallel case that's very instructive, which is that an enormous number of people are apparently addicted to music. Now, music, when you look at it, from a strictly practical survival point of view, music is a waste of time. You don't really need music, do you? I mean, you could go on and you could do your business without any music at all. Music's a luxury. And yet, it is a major industry today, producing music. And I suppose you could say, Ed Dalton made the suggestion, that people who are addicted to music have a disease called chorditis. And really, music should be stopped. It's a terrific waste of time. It achieves nothing constructive. And is really, therefore, very bad for you because you become hung up on it. You can't do without music if you're a real music lover. And even music isn't something you eat. It's just something you listen to. But boy, can you become addicted to it. So should we get rid of it? Dancing is something you do. It's also a total waste of time. And, of course, righteous Baptists and people like that have always condemned dancing. Say that's no way of behaving. They think everybody should always be dignified and shouldn't jig around. But Wilhelm Reich was perfectly correct in saying that people like that are people who are afraid of orgasm, who are afraid of the lilt. You know, in dancing, there's always this kind of motion if you really dance. And that sort of goes all through you. It's like a flip in the middle of you. It's like a whiplash, you know, where it goes flip all the way through. And if you can't do that, you see, you've got a rigid body. But even that, you see, doesn't depend directly on any kind of food stimulus, drug stimulus. But still, dancing can be very addicting. You can just plain get to like it, and you have to do it. The strange thing is, of course, that the psychedelic chemicals are not addicting, except in the sense that you may belong to some in-group, and all the members of this in-group are constantly boasting to each other of how much of this sort of stuff they've taken. And so to be respected by the group, you have to keep on taking it. But none of it has the same kind of physical addicting properties as the opiates or alcohol or tobacco, where if you relinquish their use, you get remission symptoms which are very uncomfortable. And this just doesn't occur. In other words, let's say, take any of them, mescaline, LSD, psilocybin. So far as I'm concerned, for my own personal reasons, if they all vanished off the face of the earth tomorrow, I wouldn't be too unhappy. I would only be unhappy for other people. So far as I'm concerned, I've seen what they have to tell me. I've got the message. I don't need it anymore. Because I do feel that they are really more like medicines than diets. And of course, one should not become addicted to medicine. And here we get a very curious and amusing difference between doctors and clergymen. Doctors are always trying to get rid of their patients. They give them medicine and say, now, I hope that'll work and you won't have to come back. And they give them a limited amount of the medicine on prescription. But a clergyman hopes you will come back and you'll become a member of the church and you'll pay your dues every week and generally for life get hooked on the religion. Even though there is the Latin saying about the cross of Christ, crux medicina mundi, the cross, the medicine of the world, you get addicted. Now, the Buddha, in referring to his own doctrine, his dharma, his method, likened it to a raft and said, now, when you cross the river on a raft from the shore of samsara to the shore of nirvana, when you get to the other shore, don't pick up the raft and carry it with you. Almost get there, give it a shove and send it back to the other side. But a whole lot of people, see, are on this raft. And they're absolutely fascinated with the raft. And they become monks and permanent religion people. And they go back and forth, you know. They're all ferrymen, see, who can't let go of Buddhism. And they're addicted. So, you see, it's in a very funny sense true that religion is the opium of the people, insofar as people become addicted to religion as a permanent situation. And so they're hung up on it. And this is one of the great parts of Zen training, is to get you free from Zen. If you don't get free from Zen, you suffer from what's called Zen stink. So, religion then can be addictive, for we'll say it doesn't have physical remission symptoms, but it is a psychological addiction. And so in the same way we might say that taking psychedelics, whether they be LSD or marijuana or what will you, can be psychologically addicting. It's a separate question as to whether that does any serious damage. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But you could become dependent on these things in that way. But if they were used as medicines, as I believe they should be used, then a few times it requires a little practice to use any of them properly and to get the full insights that they can afford. But once you've seen it, you've seen it. And there seems to be no point in going back and back and back and back to see it again. I will modify that statement in this way. If I am making a special study of the changes in consciousness produced by one of these substances, and I am therefore recording or in other ways studying the changes that take place, and this is naturally a difficult task, I may need to go back many times in order to get my picture straight, to see how it does it under certain different circumstances, to work out all the ramifications of it. And for me, my own reason for being interested in these things at all is that as a writer, as a philosopher, it is my great life game to describe what is allegedly undescribable. And, for example, there's a drug called dimethyltryptamine, DMT for short. And this is a 40-minute run where your consciousness is really screwed up. And I was told about this, and I inquired of the doctors whether it was, dangerous or harmful or would leave you with the heebie-jeebies. And they said, no, it doesn't do anything like that. It's just about 40 minutes of sheer insanity. And they said it renders people speechless. Well, I said, it won't render me speechless. Oh, they said, no, you come off it. So, all right, I said, I'll bet you anything you like. Give me a tape recorder and give me this chemical, and I will tell you just exactly how it feels in a coherent way. Well, wow, they gave me the first shot, which was about 1.3 cc, and although there was a kind of vaguely interesting change, nothing much happened. So then they gave me 1.9 cc, I think. And then it came on. It was as if, say, your elbow, as a point in my field of vision, suddenly came at me, but in a spiral pattern, against the background that was spiraling the other direction. See, so you've got this sort of thing going on. And then this suddenly caught hold of my body, sucked it into the system, and twisted my body into the same spiral motion. And that everything started seeming to go like this, and it was all converted into brilliantly illuminated plastic, so that it became a cross between a toy shop and Times Square, vaguely menacing. And, you hardly knew which way up you were. And so it was difficult, but patiently I talked into the tape recorder every single thing that was going on and what it was like. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you shouldn't do that. That it destroys the experience when you talk about it. It doesn't. That's the funny thing about all these things, that they're much more interesting when you do some work with them. The work seems to throw something into the experience, and then it gives you another task back. And that all adds to the interest of the thing. And I found out that in working with these things, there was no further conflict between the intellect and the intuition. That the more you intellectualized, the more the intuitive insight sprung up to correspond to the intellectual. And so, instead of, therefore, having a session in which you just curl up and go into your own little private womb and let it take over, and you come back and all you can say is, man, it was a gas. See? So what? What's the point of going on a heroic journey and not bringing something back? The whole point, in every myth, heroes who take strange journeys must bring back a feather of the fabulous bird, a claw of the dragon, or the beheaded head of the villain that they slew, and saying, see, here it is. So I always feel it's necessary in any of these adventures to bring something back. And so you get the great, intense fun
really the most stimulating thing, of saying we're going to devote this session to the study of a particular problem. One of the best LSD sessions I was ever in on was conducted by a group of people who were all very competent in the world of painting and sculpture. They knew art history. They knew how to do it. Very well-trained people. And we sat in front of the first Cubist painting that was ever done. And the whole session practically was taken up by a discussion of this painting. And it was absolutely extraordinary and rewarding. It may be that what we came out with in the end was not the truth about the painting. It may have been our Rorschach blot, that we projected something into it. I think that's very likely. But nevertheless, it drew us all out in the same way, say, there are certain people who have a marvelous capacity for drawing other people out, making them be at their best, making them talk at their best. And so the picture did that for us. And one person present was a very famous and very successful sculptor. And he said, that's what I call art criticism. But the whole conversation through this was completely sane, even though it might have had some projective elements in it, like you project on a Rorschach blot and see your own individual scene in it. But because we were all talking together, we evolved a common scene. We evolved the idea that this particular artist, living at the beginning of this century, was a master of technique. He knew all the European techniques, and therefore that he had painted 5 superimposed paintings in 5 great classical European styles and integrated them into the Cubist painting. We could see Flemish paintings, we could see French Impressionism, we could see primitive Italian, Flemish, and so on. Various levels, all together. Of course, we will never know, he's dead, whether he had this intention or not. But it sure made sense at the time. When I looked at the painting before the experience, I thought I knew what it was about. Now I look at it after the experience. I have no idea what it's about. I thought it was a painting in Cubist style of a hillside with a village on it. But now I can't see that anymore. I just can't see it. But I can again catch glimpses of the different levels that we saw during this experience. So I think then that these kind of chemicals are tools, and very strong tools. Like an automobile is a very strong tool. It's a death-dealing engine. And you have to be very careful when you drive one. Now, of course, because what is good for America is good for General Motors, etc., the other way around too, everybody sort of makes driving an automobile the test of whether you're competent. See? So they say, if you took LSD or marijuana, should you or shouldn't you drive an automobile? This is the test of whether it's a good thing or not. Now, I submit that you should not play a violin while driving an automobile. You should not make love while driving an automobile, nor should you read a book. All of these are very creative activities. But there are certain concentrated, absorbing activities that are incompatible with piloting a death-dealing engine along a freeway. And just because in a certain state of consciousness you would be incapable of being in charge of an automobile doesn't mean it's bad, unless you're a hopeless sucker for the policies of General Motors. But these things, you see, they are powerful, dangerous tools which put you into a state of consciousness which, if you don't know what's going on, can be quite terrifying. In other words, if you take a journey of this kind, you should have a map. And you should know what you're liable to encounter. Let's take this now. For example, I thought, when I first investigated this, that it couldn't possibly bring anything about like a mystical experience. And the first time I tried it, it didn't. It brought a most interesting aesthetic experience, but I wouldn't have called it mystical. But later on, when I'd said this, and a lot of people had realized that this was my opinion, another psychiatrist came and he said, I just don't think that you have been on the right track with this. You try it again. So I tried it again with him, and to my great embarrassment, it produced a mystical experience. And there could be no question about it. Now, how do I know it's a mystical experience? Well, I've had mystical experiences of a mild nature that were purely spontaneous, that were not connected with any sort of drug. And in some sense I can compare it with those, but these experiences went much deeper. And the basic feature, every time, invariably, is what I call polar awareness. Now, what is polar awareness? Polar awareness is to see that what you do and that what happens to you are aspects of the same process. Ordinarily, we pull them right apart, the voluntary and the involuntary. The behavior of the organism on the one hand, the behavior of the environment on the other. But it becomes utterly clear in this state of consciousness that what you do, think, initiate, will, and what you don't do, but what happens to you, are one and the same process. When you're steering a car and you move the wheel, are you pushing or pulling the wheel? Now, push and pull are formally opposed terms. But actually, when you consider it on a steering wheel, you are simultaneously pushing and pulling. All right? Now then, imagine that I put out my hand to pick up my pipe. This is normally a push motion, isn't it? And this, a pull motion. Now, under the effect of one of these chemicals, it becomes apparent that this motion is also being pulled. And that when I pull it towards me, I'm being pushed. At the same time, as in steering the car. In other words, as I said before in the first session, I feel myself simultaneously to be the puppet of nature, the cork on the stream, and to be in charge of everything that's happening. If I take either one of these interpretations by itself, I'll be wrong. But if I take them both together as two ways of looking at the same thing, the one modifying the other, then I realize that these two ways of talking, that I am a puppet, that I am in charge, I talk that way because I don't understand. If I did understand, all I could say was that I see that my behavior, or what has formerly been called my behavior, and all other behavior are not really separate. They are one single process. And so what happens on the inside of the skin goes with what happens on the outside. It isn't that what happens on the outside controls on the inside or vice versa. Just like when a snake goes wiggling along. Which side moves first, its left or its right? No, they move together. So in exactly the same way, you get the sensation that everything going on out there and everything going on in here is all absolutely connected. Like the two different ends of any moving object. They go this way, go that way, go this way, go that way. And you see with the most total clarity that this process that's working this way is in every way harmonious. That what is happening is what ought to happen. Including people's objections to what is happening. They ought to happen too. You just see that everything in this universe is in accordance with the Buddhist doctrine called Jiji Muge. This means the mutual interdependence of all things and events. That everything in the universe is vitally important. The whole universe hangs on every single event or thing that is in it. And without it, the whole could not be. It all is of a piece. As Teilhard de Chardin said, the only true atom, that is the indivisible unit, is the universe itself. For if we take anything out of the universe and separate it, it is raveled at all its edges. Because everything is interconnected. That's what you see. And you see it with just complete clarity, and you say, my God, what's the matter with me? Why didn't I see that before? It's so completely obvious. At a somewhat deeper level of this experience, it also becomes obvious that this is a little bit more difficult to describe. But you see absolutely clearly that you and the eternal energy of the world are the same thing. But that energy is pulsing. And all energy is only known in terms of pulsation. In other words, constant pressure applied without pulse is not energy. Because that constant pressure applied is all one direction. Energy is very slow or very fast. So slow that you don't notice the pulse, or so fast that you don't notice the pulse. But it's still pulse. So, to be and not to be, life and death, appearing and disappearing, are all forms of it. And therefore, you live... Let's go back to our vision of the world as energy patterns. And imagine, we make a picture of these energy patterns as ripples, you see. Go back to the image of the water. Ripples appearing and disappearing in water. You suddenly see that all this, the people around you, the houses, the mountains, the stars, are ripples in a kind of energy water. And they come and they go, they come and they go, they come and they go, but the water is always there. And that's you. That there's this marvelous mirage going on. But you are it. You're not just the ripple that comes and then disappears. You're the whole process. Only, you don't always know it, for the simple reason that part of the fun of the whole thing is to forget it, and to imagine that you're all lost and alone. And wowee, what a thrill that is, see? And it does all these things. And it does it in ever so many dimensions. Because it isn't only this universe that we see now, there are probably infinitely many universes that could be visualized by different sense organs, different receivers, different wavelengths as on the radio. Now, when you get into that state, and you're not ready for it, you may get scared absolutely out of your wits. Because you suddenly feel the unaccustomed sensation of I'm doing the whole thing. And you see everything that you do notice outside you is known to you as a transformation of your own nervous system. And insofar as that is you, then you are the behavior of the man working out there on the roof. And if you think that's the case, you should say, oh heavens, I'm in charge of the whole universe. What a sticky situation that is. Like the kid who turned himself into the Los Angeles police on a bad trip with a piece of paper which said, please help me, signed Jehovah. Or on the other hand, you may feel the opposite, that you're absolutely powerless, and that everything you do is simply the determined effects of anything, and then you think, well, how can I rely on that? How do I know that I'll be able to think in English the next minute? How will I remember who I am? Will I know the way home? How can I be sure I won't commit a murder, or commit suicide, or do something dreadful? And you suddenly see you have no guarantee. Either way, you know, if you're God, how can God rely on himself to be always sensible? It's real spooky. So naturally, a lot of people feel completely insecure, no ground to put their foot on, because there's no longer anything other. You see that, for example, other is a different kind of other. You see that self and other simply presuppose each other. You wouldn't know who you were. You wouldn't know what you meant by me unless you felt something other than you. Well, that implies the two go together. They're inseparable. They're one life. And then that disturbs people. And so as a result of that, they start calling for help. And as you panic, the panic is exaggerated because everything that you feel is exaggerated, is more intense. And people think up the most weird horrors. They get paranoid and project all sorts of ghastly schemes that are afoot to destroy them. That's why the underground press is so full of paranoia. Because of so many of these people are on LSD or something. So they get very paranoid. But if you understand the principles of this, if you understand what organism-environment unity is, what reciprocity is, what the doctrine of Jiji Muge is, instead of getting frightened, you say, well, look at that now. It was true after all. That's the way it works. And you just relax. And you let you happen. Because there's nobody left apart from the whole experience to permit it to happen or not permit it to happen. You are simply what goes on. And you're not either controlled by it because there's no you separate from it to be controlled by it, and you don't control it because there's no you separate from it to control it. It is just what gives. So it's neither voluntaristic on the one hand, nor deterministic on the other. Now that's a difficult idea to get through into people's common sense. But anybody who has had a deep experience, either straight mystical or through one of these chemicals, knows exactly what that means. Just as a person who's a mature student in physics understands Einstein's relativity theory, almost without it having to be explained. And for me, that is a great mystical experience. And furthermore, is very valuable for the reason that I mentioned in the first lecture, that we have to realize our actual full energy relationship to the external world, so that we can create a human civilization which cooperates with nature instead of opposing it.